Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today I found a channel that I would like to respond to, specifically to one of their videos, but it's possible they will respond to multiple in the next coming days and weeks because I think it's an interesting opportunity for discussion. Now, the channel in question is called Home Team History. They have 807,000 subscribers and 541 videos. As we can read through the description of their own channel, they read, "Remembering our ancestors through reasonable dialogue," so I already appreciate this, and "reclaiming the world from an African perspective." So clearly the author is, I imagine, from African, either descent or an African. I don't know. I have seen him. He's a black man, but I don't know if he's a black man from Africa or is he a black man of an African ancestry. Up to this point, I have no problem because, of course, I very much like to speak about European history as a European. So I have no problem with an African or someone of African descent to want to focus on the African perspective on history. With that being said, what video are we checking? The video in question is called "Was Ancient Carthage a Black Civilization?"
In a previous video I did about the Carthaginian voyage of Hannibal into West Africa, some of you took issue with the illustrations used throughout the video, and I can certainly understand that, as Carthage is largely promoted as a Mediterranean civilization throughout popular culture, and many don't want that narrative to take more precedence than it already has. But your inquiries did get me thinking about Carthaginian civilization in general. I began to realize I never really investigated or studied Carthage like I've done for other African civilizations. So today, based on my own research, I wanted to give us a foundation from which we can understand Carthaginian civilization, and through this, hopefully we can find out if Carthage would be considered a so-called black civilization.
No, I don't think Carthage should be considered a black civilization, although there were elements within the strata of Carthage that would have been black, including priests, high priests, and people, political power and influence, and they had a black enclave within the city of Carthage proper. So, were black people living in Carthage? Yes. Were there some black Carthaginians? Yes. Were they a black civilization? No. That would be my answer. It was civilization of Levantine origin. So what happened is that he used images to represent Carthaginians that looked Semitic. They didn't look black. And seems like his audience complained about it. And so he decided to dig deeply into it in order to see if he can actually say that they were black. It's interesting. I had never seen that happen before, so I'm kind of curious to see what's going to happen. Nice intro, man.
Even though the terminology of black is a little outdated, for the purposes of this video and for simplicity, I'm going to have to use it. The way I define black or black civilization is mostly through a Western point of view. So the term in general will be defined as having a close relationship or origin with the people we would consider black today in the Caribbean or the Americas.
He's starting strong because he's making sure that by the very beginning of the video, we all know what he means when he says black. And I appreciate that. I don't know why he says black is dated. You mean in the historical period that's talking about the ancient period? Then maybe I understand, but that's a good way to start.
I think the best way to answer the question on the demographics of Carthage is to study the history of North Africa in general. North Africa has the most unique history on the continent because there's not only so much we don't know about it, but because the desertification of North Africa over time drastically impacted its history. Personally, I break up North African history into 3 periods to help me understand it better. There's prehistoric North Africa, ancient North Africa, and then medieval. I know prehistoric and ancient can be considered the same thing, but I separate them because, again, the desertification of North Africa affected its history so much. Prehistoric
I think he's talking about the fact that the Sahara wasn't a desert up to a certain period. Before that, it was crossable, it was green, we know that 100%, so I agree with that. And also, I tend to use ancient meaning clearly from the discovery of metal. That's when I personally use ancient. Sure, you could apply ancient to prehistoric, but usually I do specify prehistoric in that case. So I think we use similar terminology here.
North Africa was a time when the entire region was flourishing with wildlife, trees, grass,
Yep.
and even rivers.
Correct.
We know about this because of prehistoric wall paintings. Now, from my research, the majority of prehistoric North Africa seems to have been populated by people groups we would consider black today, or ethnic groups indistinguishable from Africans we would see today in, say, Senegal or Nigeria. The biggest evidence we have affirming this are the wall paintings they left behind. The absolutely devastating event of North African desertification seems to have greatly affected the lives of prehistoric populations as they were displaced and had to move further south. There are many oral histories from Africans who are now below the Sahara who say they originally came from a region further in the north. In this discussion, it's important to consider prehistoric North African populations because they continue to be a forgotten presence throughout the history of the region. After the desertification, we get more into what I would consider ancient North Africa. Unfortunately, putting a timeline on the desertification isn't easy and certainly not exact, so I'll refrain from doing so. But one of the more prominent peoples of North African civilization outside of Nubia or Egypt were the Garamanti peoples, who were brought to our attention through literature around 500 BC. But, in all likelihood, they were a group of people who existed in the Sahara much earlier, perhaps around 1000 BC. From the onset, the Garamanti people are seen as being diverse in phenotype. Now, we can't say for certain.
As you see, I'm not the only one who talks about the diversity, phenotypic diversity, and therefore multi-ethnicity of Northern Africa. And that's one of the things that I strongly push. I say the Egyptians were multi-ethnic. I don't know if he agrees with that. I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but at least he agrees that certain areas, even if he was one of those who says, no, Egyptians were all black, still he agrees that the other populations that lived in Northern Africa would have been multi-ethnic, which is my position. And it's always been my position, and it's the one position that I get attacked and hated the most with the people that make the debunking video, Metatron liar, Metatron fraud, and then they present no evidence. It's all character assassination. But there you go. As you can see, black man, channel dedicated to Africa, extremely successful. He is saying what I say, North Africa was multi-ethnic and it had significant phenotypic variance and diversity.
And that prehistoric North Africa was more phenotypically uniform. But there's no doubt that by the time of the Garamantes, North Africa was very phenotypically diverse.
Absolutely.
At least more so than the rest of Africa. The physical
Preach it, brother. At this point, I'm gonna say.
appearance of the Garamantes has been observed and commented on frequently by Greeks and Romans. Even though the records can be a little confusing, as some commenters associate the Garamantes as being Ethiopians, aka black people, and others distinguish them from the Ethiopians. This merely confirms the fact that the Garamantes were indeed diverse.
Absolutely.
There seems to have been little difference between Garamanti civilization and modern Amazigh populations throughout North Africa. I believe that the issue of Garamanti demographics is important, because it can be seen as a model for Carthaginian civilization. Even though Carthage had received migration and foreign influence from outside of Africa, that prehistoric base still seems to have been present. I'll get to that in a minute, but let's talk about Carthaginian civilization as a whole. Carthage began as a Phoenician colony in the 9th century BC, around modern-day Tunisia. Their exact origin still isn't clear, but most agree that they came from the Levant region. But it continues to be an ongoing debate, because Herodotus tells us something that we simply can't ignore concerning the origin of the Phoenicians. This is what Herodotus has to say. This nation, according to their own account, dwelt anciently upon the Erythraean Sea, but crossing thence fixed themselves on the sea coast of Syria, where they still inhabit.
I see where he's going with that. I'll have to disagree, but I'll let him finish.
So essentially, Herodotus is telling us that according to Phoenician oral history, they may have been Africans from the Horn who migrated to the Levant region. Now, even if this is true, that the Phoenicians were originally Africans, they still would have intermingled with the populations they encountered in the Levant.
Alright, so what does this passage by Herodotus mean? So we read this nation, and in this case we are discussing the fact that it would be talking about the Phoenicians. I will add more context onto this, but let's for a moment take this at face value. Yes, he's talking about the Phoenicians. And then he says, according to their own account, dwelt anciently upon the Erythraean Sea, but crossing thence fixed themselves on the sea coast of Syria, where they still inhabit. So there is a sea mentioned, Erythraean Sea, they crossed it. So they come from the other side of this sea. Now, the way this gentleman is interpreting this, and I notice this happens a lot within also the Afrocentric community, is that because Erythraean Sea translates as the Red Sea, and then if you look at any map that we've got, the Red Sea is the sea that divides the African continent here from Saudi Arabia and all this section here in the Near East, so Asia, even though they connect in this part here. Eritrea is this area here. If you heard him, he talked about the Horn of Africa. For context, this is the Horn of Africa, so as you see, Eritrea. Hence, what he is implying here is that originally the Phoenicians were from here. Then they cross this sea. I don't know what he bases the idea that if it really did happen that they came from Africa, why here? Just because it's called Erythraean Sea. Even if you interpret it as the Red Sea, it's quite large. But for a moment, he's saying they were from somewhere here, I guess, and they crossed, boom, they settled in Syria, but they were originally Africans. And now this is a very superficial and ultimately incorrect interpretation. And here's how I'm going to justify this. This is Herodotus. The man is from the 5th century BC, hence we're talking about the perspective and geographic nomenclature used by someone who lived 2,500 years before us. Hence, it comes to reason to understand that oftentimes the geopolitical situation and the nomenclature of physical geography would differ very much to the way we use it today. Now, when he says the Red Sea, so this Greek word here, which is obviously often translated as the Red Sea, does not match this. it would be better translated as the Persian Gulf. This is the sea that he's talking about in this specific passage. And for larger context, this is the Red Sea we were talking about a second ago. It's one sea over. It's this one here. This is what he's talking about, not this. How do I prove that? For proof, I'm going to read Herodotus' own words on a separate passage, passages 180 and 189. They read as follows, open quotes. Thus, then, was this wall built. The city, Babylon, is divided into two parts, for it is cut in half by a river named Euphrates, a wide, deep, and swift river flowing from Armenia and issuing into the Red Sea. Yes, he's using the same nomenclature in Greek. Passage 189, another river, the Tigris, which again passes the city of Opis and issues into the Red Sea. The Tigris and Euphrates are two rivers that are specifically in this region, and they both go down and issue into the Persian Gulf, not the modern Red Sea. So there is no question, considering that he gave us not one but two examples of rivers that issue into the sea, that when in these passages Herodotus is talking about the Red Sea, is talking about the Persian Gulf, not the modern Red Sea. Given, for complete context, there is another passage where he's talking about the circumnavigation of Africa, where, due to some of the information he reports, he uses the term Red Sea to actually mean the modern Red Sea. It's a little confusing, of course. Maybe they call both Red Sea, we don't really know. And this would be in passage 158 of Book 2. And the reason why we can say that most likely in that case he's actually talking about our current Red Sea is because he was talking about a specific canal that was built by an Egyptian pharaoh. When we read Red Sea in Herodotus, it could be either the modern Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, and only context can help us identify it. But considering the fact that he does specifically talk about those two rivers when trying to geo-identify it, there is no question that Herodotus' words in this case do not mean that an African people crossed the modern Red Sea, but it just means that a Middle Eastern people crossed the Persian Gulf and eventually became the Levantine people. There were the Phoenicians that then ended up in North Africa to found Carthage. And since I did promise I was going to come back to this word, this nation, we also need to keep in mind that when Herodotus talks about the Phoenicians, in quotes, he's most likely using it as an umbrella term for a lot of different populations in the Levant. So Levantine populations, a population cluster. That's my response to that.
Even though Carthage had received migration and foreign influence from outside of Africa, that prehistoric base still seems to have been present. I'll get to that in a minute. Carthage?
Yeah, the idea that there were some prehistoric black tribes and people and villages in the area where eventually Carthage will rise, it's very likely. But that doesn't mean that Carthage was black. I'm not trying to strawman him, so I want to hear him now speak about, because of course we know they come from the Levant. The Carthaginians are Phoenicians. There's no question about it. I don't think that that's sustainable, because if they were Africans, the Phoenicians, then we would have been told so. Because the Romans did speak, and the Greeks did speak about the looks of people. They described people phenotypically. This idea, not that he's pushing it, but some people are, that the ancients didn't see color. The ancients didn't classify people by color. They didn't in the modern sense, of course, because the idea of white and black changes constantly, and it's very much of a construct that is loosely based on actual phenotypic traits. And that is simple. I mean, you could see that because people call me white, but sometimes they don't. I'm like, am I white or am I not white? Which one is it? No, you're not white, you're Italian. Italians are not white. But then someone else will say, why is this white man talking to us? I'm like, wait, I thought I wasn't a white man. Which one is it? Now, I do identify as white. I think someone who's European and has pale skin is white. That's how I use it. But there are people, for example, in some areas in America that only consider white people of Anglo-Saxon descent or Nordic. But even Irish are not considered white, even though I don't understand how that's possible, since Irish are as white as this. With that being said, it is what it is. It changes with time, and even black can change with time. So it is a construct, but it is loosely rooted on real physical characteristics that can be seen and everybody saw since the prehistory. Absolutely. This idea that, oh no, differences in color is a modern creation, not true. In fact, the Romans used the term white, used the term blonde, and used the term black, and describe people by their phenotypic trait. It's just that they didn't have a modern racial approach for obvious reasons, but I think it's kind of a tribalistic nature of, oh, those people look blonde, we don't, they're different from us. Oh, those people look black, we don't, oh, they're different from us. That happens. This has always happened since probably the Paleolithic period, whenever there was migration of population clusters. And then there is the whole iconography. Every time we see in iconography Phoenicians represented, they don't look black. So we can't just disregard all of the iconography. But yeah.
Originally Africans, they still would have intermingled with the populations they encountered in the Levant, diversifying their group.
Okay.
Regardless, this history concerning Phoenician origins is what causes a lot of controversy when it comes to the Africanness of Carthage, if you will. Now, even though the Phoenicians founded Carthage, it was the Libyans in Africa who largely peopled the area and played a dominant role in the development of its civilization. And the ancient population of Libya is yet another exhausting and confusing topic, as there seems to be diversity as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so we are in agreement. I actually appreciate, because the channels that annoy me are the ones that just make statements of fact just because they want things to be one way or another, whether it be that you want everyone to be white or whether it be that you want everyone to be black. At least he's looking at the sources, which anyone who spends time with the sources will come to this exact conclusion: multi-ethnicity in Northern Africa. And how couldn't it be? It is literally a conduit and a connection between three continents: Europe, Africa, and Asia. Of course it's going to be multi-ethnic, particularly in the areas of Libya, Northwest, Mauritania, all of that sections, Africa Proconsularis, but also Aegyptus, so Egypt, the Delta area would have been a lot more multi-ethnic than, I want to say, Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt would have had a high percentage of black Egyptians and also intermingling with Nubians, Upper Egypt, but the Delta area, I strongly think the black people were a minority there. But still, we're not talking about Egypt. Let's go with Hannibal.
So from the very beginning, Carthage takes on various people groups from the Phoenicians and the Libyans, who at their core seem to be diverse. Also, we can't neglect the people groups who were already there before the arrival of Phoenicians and Libyans, perhaps mostly ancient Amazigh populations and other ethnic groups that may have reflected the realities of the former prehistoric population. But in order for this video to have any value in the diaspora, I must talk about the evidence about the argument for a so-called Black Carthage. When scholars from various fields began studying some skeletal remains of ancient Carthaginians, they found something interesting. They found the remains of the highly venerated priestess of Tanit, the most ornate and
she was black, exactly,
most artistic sarcophagus found. Professor Eugene Petard had this to say about the discovery: the woman buried there had Negro features. She belonged to the African race. This discovery was pretty fascinating because religious figures held a lot of power in ancient societies. Thus, this black priestess, whoever she was certainly among the elite class within Carthage. Now, of course, the discovery of one black woman cannot reflect the entire populace. So what other evidence exists? Well, Professor Stefan Gesell apparently conducted a study on Carthaginian skeletons, and he declared that the so-called Semitic type, characterized by the long, perfectly oval face, the thin alkaline nose, and the lengthened cranium enlarged over the nape of the neck, has not yet been found in Carthage. That's a pretty strong statement. Now, assuming the skeletal remains
But I wish you also told us what the skeletons look like then.
of the Carthaginians were dated before the Roman and Vandal occupation, the previous comments by these professors no doubt challenged popular culture's view of Carthaginian demographics. But even though we haven't found the so-called Semitic type in Carthage, according to Professor Gesell, that still doesn't mean that black people were the predominant in Carthage.
See, that's why I like this guy, because at least he's being fair with his positions. I often disagree with his statements and conclusions for what I've seen so far, but as you can see, at least it's not so, like, he will present both sides of the argument as it's supposed to be when you approach something professionally. He also has a very smooth voice, doesn't he? Like radio.
Previous evidence for Phoenician and later Libyan dominance of Carthage, married with the comments from the professor, seems to prove what we've always seen throughout ancient North African history, which is a pretty diverse model. The big difference seems to be the status black people maintained in Carthage, because the
very good point, yes.
image of black people has been so tarnished over time. Anytime we look at ancient history, we immediately assume the presence of black people in highly civilized areas must have been slaves or held subservient positions. I think we can say with confidence that this was not at all the case in Carthage.
Yeah, I agree with that.
As we can see from the remains of a high priestess, black people were very much a part of elite Carthaginian civilization. The question,
in fact, that would be a big difference between for example, there were black people in Rome that did get enslaved, and that is because the Romans literally enslaved everyone. At least when it comes to that, the Romans weren't racist. They hated everyone equally, which means that they would enslave white people, black people, it doesn't matter. They will enslave you, blondes, reds, blues, whatever. They'll enslave you. I think there would have been a higher, if you wanted to see where some black slaves, together with other slaves of other ethnicities, would have been concentrated, then Rome would have been a good example of that. Although there would have been some people in Rome that were black but were citizens, or at that point, they're not slaves, of course, and they can be successful, they can be merchants, they can even have a certain level of political power. Not Septimius Severus, he was not black. But when it comes to other elements within the Roman society system, particularly after certain reforms, absolutely. But I think Carthage would be the place where there may have still been some black slaves, because let's do keep in mind that it wasn't only white people that enslaved black people enslaved black people too. But Carthage is the place where you will find, that's what we can see, several people who were black, were free, were citizens, had positions of power, were rich, and even were part of the clergy, and who knows, the Senate. Very possible. Still doesn't make it a black civilization, but very possible. Now I see an elephant. Is he going with Hannibal?
Alone about the ethnic persuasion of Hannibal Barca, the greatest ruling figure Carthage had ever known, is clear indication concerning the significance and or presence of the black Carthaginian elite. The elephant in the room when it comes to Carthage has always been Hannibal Barca's ethnicity.
The elephant in the room, that was smooth.
Even the black men, no doubt, present in Hannibal's army has been controversial, because the persistent image of black people in elite positions within preeminent ancient civilizations does not sit well with our society today.
Depends who you ask. I don't have a problem if that's what evidence presents. It doesn't matter. That's what we want to know. We just want to know the truth. I still don't think Hannibal was black, though. So I want to see how you're going to present it, because the coins are there and they do not point in that direction.
Was Hannibal a black man and therefore a reflection of the greatest black elite dynasty within Carthaginian civilization? An honest answer to that question is no one really knows for sure, because scholars cannot confirm with certainty the existence of any authentic images of him. However, the strongest evidence we may have concerning an actual depiction of the great Hannibal Barca comes from the coin of Trasimeno. The Western world will consistently present to you about 3 images or so that they believe are portraits of Hannibal. Unfortunately, they present these images without much context. All 3 of these images have a sort of Mediterranean look, and according to Francis Polsky, a noted iconographer, the popular bust of Hannibal
it's probably not authentic.
Is not of Hannibal at all, but simply the ideal representation of a hero. The best chance of actually having a general idea of Hannibal's physical features are from coins. There currently exist about 8 coins that may be associated with Hannibal himself, but the coin that creates the greatest stir is the coin of Trasimeno. Most coins that...
I mean, these are the good coins, by the way. These are coins, unless you find a way to disqualify these coins, which I don't know how you would, because they represent the entirety of the family. We see Hamilcar, we see Asdrubal, we see Hannibal, and given, you could tell me, well, yeah, but we're not 100% sure that that's Hannibal. Okay, but we are quite sure that that's the rest of the family. So wouldn't it make sense that Hannibal looked like the rest of his family? If you see my father and you have never seen me, well, you could try and at least give, my dad has got long hair, he's got black hair, he's got same facial features, he's got a bit of a bigger nose than me, he's a bit taller than me, but yeah, you could tell I'm his son. And so I think looking at the family, it's a very good indication, and these coins look clearly Mediterranean and Semitic, 100%.
That are promoted as being from the Barca family are ultimately representations of Punic gods and are often not meant to be representations of the Barca family phenotype. Before I get...
You have to qualify that.
Get into this coin, it's important to understand that I'm not making the argument that this coin is of Hannibal. I'm making the argument that there is no reason why this coin should be ignored as it is in popular...
There is reason actually to be ignored, and I know which coin is going to show. There is a reason why that coin should be ignored, but I'll present it after you show the coin and defend your case.
...and scholarly spaces. The discovery of this coin and others like it are very inconvenient. It was discovered in Italy, dated about 217 BC in the vicinity of Lake Trasimeno after Hannibal defeated the Romans there. Now, some make the claim that Hannibal never minted coins in Italy, but that simply isn't the case.
That is wrong.
He did issue an electrum coinage in Capua, Italy, and so a history of him doing so exists. After his victory at Trasimeno and the discovery of the Trasimeno coin, the obvious conclusion is that either the coin is a depiction of a Punic god or the victor himself, Hannibal. The coin is likely not a depiction of an elephant driver, because the elephant depicted on the coin is an Indian elephant, and the sole surviving elephant of Hannibal after he crossed the mountains was an Indian, one that Hannibal rode on himself. And so the implications speak for themselves and creates a narrative that's in complete opposition to what popular culture promotes. However, as of late, it seems as though that's beginning to change slightly, with the more recent depiction of Hannibal as a black man in the History Channel's series called Barbarians Rising. So
Yeah, but I think they're doing that not because there is a valid argument to be made. They're doing it to virtue signal.
what am I trying to say? Well, Carthage, upon further review, was a typical North African civilization.
Yes,
One that was obviously diverse.
absolutely.
Make an absolute statement about its status of being a black civilization only depends on what sources you decide to put more weight into. But I think a proper historical perspective will lead you to ask different questions rather than make absolute statements.
Yes.
Questions like, what kind of role did black people have in Carthaginian civilization?
Absolutely.
And given the evidence we've collected today, I think the answer is a significant one. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and supporting this content. If you'd like access to full courses and sources, or you simply want to show your support, you may do so by clicking the Patreon link in the description box below.
Now, this channel presents ideas that I disagree with, but other times he has got some videos that I actually found really nice, because I watched a little bit of his videos. So it's a little bit of a case by case. It's not one of those channels that I've attacked relentlessly, or you know me, that were just pushing nonsense and propaganda. It just seems to be a channel that sometimes we disagree completely, and other times we actually are on the same page. Join me as I discuss African history, culture and worldview, and what it all really means for us today. I encourage us to learn and share our thoughts, as this will help us reclaim our history and pioneer a new culture of awareness. Now, I usually find this to be a red flag when they say our history, but I do want to give him the benefit of the doubt, which is something that my haters never give me. So I want to be elegant about this. The reason why this can be a red flag is because I noticed that whenever I speak about African history, even if it's North African history, so actually we could say more largely the history of the Mediterranean basin, as a Mediterranean man, even though I'm not from Africa, still I like to have a little bit of a uniting look into it, since it's something we share, the coasts of the Mediterranean. And whenever I do that, some people that absolutely hate me because of the color of my skin will say, stop talking about our history, and they write it like this, capital. So that's why that has become something, when I see it, it makes me cringe a little bit. But in this case, if he only means it as, well, it's our history because I'm speaking about Africa specifically, and I'm African, then there is nothing wrong.
Well, I'm all out, guys. If you like these videos and want to help,
Yeah, no, good. Very fair. As I say, I disagreed with a few things, but as you see, compare this video that we just watched. Even though I disagreed with a few points, I agreed with a lot of the stuff that he said. In fact, we say a lot of the same stuff. It's just that when he says it's okay, when I say it, it's whatever. Compare this video, which was intellectually honest, with the video about whether or not Hannibal Barca was black, made by the likes of Mr. Imhotep. And then tell me what you see. Thank you, noble ones. And thank you, Home Team History. I think you did a good job anyways. I appreciated the intellectual honesty. I'll watch more of your videos. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.